Hello, everybody, and a very warm welcome to the Conversations program and to the Art Market talk this afternoon. My name is Emily Villar. I manage this edition of Conversations here in Basel. And our moderator for this afternoon is Dr. Jeni Fulton, Art Basel's executive editor. I shall shortly hand over to Jeni for proper introductions to our wonderful lineup of speakers here this afternoon. But before that, just a kind reminder to keep your mask on at all times, also during the Q&A. Our two hosts will be holding up the microphone for you to speak, so please keep it on. Okay, thank you. I will hand over to Jeni.
Thank you, Emily, and welcome everyone. Very pleased to have you here this afternoon. I'm Jeni Fulton. I'm Art Basel's executive editor, and I'm really happy to be hosting this panel, which is called Galleries Adapt to a Changing Landscape. The panel will take an in-depth look into the findings of the Art Market Report's 2021 mid-year review, and in particular how galleries have fared bouncing back from a very strange 2020. We'll also look into collector behaviour, and then I'm very pleased to introduce a very special guest in the middle here, Sophie Perceval from Wonder AI, who will give us an overview into her company's research into how exhibitions at gallery institutional level shape artists' careers. But first I would like to introduce Dr. Clare McAndrew, the founder of Arts Economics, who is the author of The Art Market, which is an annual review that we co-publish with UBS, and who authored the 2021 mid-year review. And she will be giving us a short introduction to her findings, and then we will go into the panel discussion. And last but not least, to the extreme left from your point of view, no, right from your point of view, is Jasmine Chow from the founder of JTT Gallery. And she is on Art Basel's advisory committee for the statement sector, which is dedicated to younger galleries. So from her, we're going to really have the perspective of sort of more emerging voices and the challenges that they've faced inside this landscape. So Claire, pleased to hand over to you.
Thank you. Thanks very much, Jeni. I'm delighted to be here, and I suppose this was the year, I guess, that we thought everything was going to be back to normal, but it's not really quite there yet, although it's great that we're all here in person. I think the galleries are still operating under some fairly challenging conditions, and we've seen that the calendar is not quite back to the way it was, certainly in the first half of the year, which is when the focus of the research that we did is on. But this kind of mid-year report gave us a chance just to touch base with galleries and see how they were faring in this kind of difficult time. And it's been a very fascinating time, maybe when I'm one step removed, to be looking at the art market, because I think the longer these sort of interim conditions last, the more people have been adapting and changing the ways they behave. And I think the longer they kind of linger, the more people become used to operating in slightly different ways. And so it's, along with all the difficulties faced, I think there has been some changes that we've seen, and not all of them are negative. So there is some kind of cautiously optimistic findings in the research as well. So I was just going to go through a few of the main key findings. I suppose the big focus for everyone is sales and how they did in the first 6 months of the year. And if you aggregate all the people that we did in the sample and weight them by their turnover, sales were up about 10% on the same period in 2020. So the first 6 months of 2021 was up 10% on the first 6 months of 2020. And that's a funny kind of benchmark, because I guess the first 3 months of 2020 were probably okay for a lot of galleries. It wasn't till till March on that the pandemic really hit. But good signs that overall things are improving. What we are seeing, which changed a bit last year, is we're seeing some of those old hierarchies kind of returning. So the biggest galleries were among the worst performing last year in 2020, but in the first 6 months of this year, they've returned to be some of the best performing. And the segments under the most pressure are the smallest galleries, ones turning over less than 250,000 a year, and the kind of, I suppose, mid-sized 500,000 to $1 million in turnover. They were under the most pressure in this particular period, and some of that's statistical, I suppose. If you're down in a bigger hole, when you're climbing out of the hole, the increase is going to be bigger. But I think the concept that online was going to be the great leveler and level the playing field is didn't come to fruition as much as it was forecast. But online has been huge, obviously, in the last 18 months. It's been the kind of standout finding of all the research we've done over the last 18 months, is the shift to online. If you're looking at sales by galleries themselves. It went from about 12% in 2019, and it's now reached 33% and 37% if you include art fair OVR. So it's a huge shift. And the corollary of that, of course, is that art fair sales are down. So when we did the research in 2019, it was about 46% of sales by galleries were at art fairs. This is down to 7% now, this in the first 6 months of this year. So a huge drop. It's 11% if you include art fair OVRs, but obviously a big drop. Not that surprising given the way the calendar was, particularly in the first half of this year, but still a big drop in sales. A sort of a nice and slightly surprising finding was what happened to gallery sales. They did increase in share to 55%, and this is what we've noted anecdotally from galleries, from talking to them, and from collectors as well, is that people have been more willing, I think, over the last 6 months, if they're not traveling, to go back to visiting galleries a little bit more. And whether they're operating by kind of appointment only or whether they're business as usual, galleries have kind of said that there is people coming in, and I suppose if they're making an appointment to come in, their intent is a little bit more serious as well. So people are returning to visiting galleries, which is a kind of a silver lining, I guess, a little bit of the changes that have happened in the last little while. Just focusing on online, I think one thing that galleries have also said to me during the research is that it still remains to be seen how good it is, and maybe we can talk about this, how good it is at finding new clients, how easy it is to find new clients online. I think galleries are saying it's easy enough to make a sale to somebody that you know already or you're familiar with and they're familiar with you, and it might be easy to make a kind of a once-off sale based on particular works. But establishing long-term relationships and kind of finding new collectors and establishing those connections is still more difficult. And I think this is why everyone was really welcoming coming back to the physical exhibitions like fairs. And this continued in the first half of the year. You can see about 60% of the sales that galleries made online were to people that were already familiar with the gallery or with the dealer, and only 38% were to brand new people that had never been to the gallery or met the dealer before. So still the minority, although it did increase a little bit from the end of the year. And it's difficult to read sometimes that statistic, whether it means that for some galleries it means their digital strategies are working quite well, their geographical reach is getting better perhaps, and for other galleries it's that repeat business is maybe more difficult online, so they're selling more to new buyers because they have to sell more to new buyers online because they can't get people to come back that second time. So, and you can really see that in the priorities that they reported in this survey as well. I think for the last 18 months, the importance of people you have already, collectors that you're familiar with, has been the highest priority, even higher than finding new buyers. It seems to be established relationships with collectors has been key. And you can see there for the next 18 months, and at the moment online is staying a key priority, and fairs have been way down on the priorities last year, but they're moving back up now, and especially looking forward to the next 12 to 18 months, they're moving back up in the priorities of dealers as well. I think some of the things that are driving that outsized performance at the high end is some amazing spending by wealthy collectors over the last period. And we've returned again with UBS Investor Watch to survey high net worth collectors. We covered 5 different markets in this piece of research. It was the US, UK, Germany, Switzerland, and Hong Kong. And so this is the results from about 500 collectors, all high net worth individuals that are active in the art market. And there's some amazing increase in spending. So the spending by this group, the median spend, which is the kind of middle of the distribution, was up 40% on the entire year in 2020. So the spending on art and antiques was up by 40%. And that's amazing enough in itself, but also it's even increased on 2019. So spending is up on last year, which is perhaps not that surprising, but also higher than the entire year in 2019. So there is a segment of the market that is very actively spending. And I think it's related to the fact that this is quite a different crisis perhaps than the global financial crisis or other ones we've seen, in that people, high net worth individuals, didn't necessarily get poorer last year, and a lot of people with millionaires and billionaires actually got more wealthy and had a little bit more time in some cases. So there hasn't been that kind of drop in spending at the high end that we've seen in other recessions. So it's very interesting, and you can really see there that it's definitely millennials driving that increase in spending. They had by far the highest average spend. They might not have the biggest collections per se, but they have they're the most active in the market at the moment, and their spending was, you can see there it's about double their Gen X peers and about 4 times the level of boomers. So they're really a very active, engaged segment in the market, buying online and offline. They're among the highest spending segments, and this is what we've seen the last few rounds of this research with UBS as well. So it's not necessarily a new finding. What was really interesting was to look at what they're buying and what mediums they're buying in. And across the board, still the more traditional mediums of, the kind of unique works, painting, sculpture, works on paper, were the things that people were buying most of in the first half of the year. But very interesting there, I suppose it's got such a spotlight with kind of NFTs and all this kind of stuff, is digital art. 12% of the value of spending by this high net worth segment that we surveyed was on digital art. And again, millennials by far spending the most. Their average spend on digital art was 20,000 in the first 6 months of the year, much higher than Gen X and boomers. And Gen Z also quite high as well. They're really the ones to watch. They're quite small pool in this particular survey that we do, but very interesting dynamics. And I think it's interesting too, because you do get some kind of cliches that they're only interested in digital art, younger collectors and things like that. I mean, they still spent probably 4 times more on paintings than they did on digital art. So there is some kind of cliches that are not quite right, but they're definitely the ones to watch over the next period, and some very active collectors in this surveys. I think as well, when we asked these high net worth collectors what they plan on buying in the next 12 months, and nearly half of the collectors in the sample were interested in buying digital art. So this is a kind of a trend that's lasting, and it's people spending more time online, I'm sure, and the whole buzz around NFTs and all of these things have all helped people to become more interested in the space. But this is a huge, unfortunately, we don't have something to market against what it was like 5 years ago, but this is something that we'll be tracking going forward. And again, very strong interest from across the board. It's actually Gen X collectors were the most interested in purchasing digital art over the next 12 months, but millennials also pretty strong. Not so much boomers. They were more interested in more traditional mediums. Just the last thing, and probably the most important thing we looked at in the research, was employment in the gallery sector. I think sales can probably go up and down a little bit, and high net worth collector spending can go up and down, but I think the biggest issue for a lot of galleries in the last year or so was how to kind of stay afloat and how to keep people employed. And it's been a very difficult and challenging period, I think, for a lot of galleries. And we have, the people have reported job losses over the last year, and I think there was a kind of a knee-jerk reaction in some cases when people were trying to cut costs to kind of get rid of people as well in some instances, in order to sort of stay afloat. And some regions were helped better by governments than others to keep employees furloughed or whatever the case was. But there is some kind of, again, cautiously optimistic findings in this area as well, in that at least on average, the averages have gone up. They took a dip in 2020 and they're on the rise again. And certainly this year, based on the first 6 months, there's actually more people hiring now than there is downsizing, and that was the opposite trend last year. We saw a lot more people downsizing than there was hiring. And people are reporting they're hiring kind of different people and things like that, but still, I mean, we had some kind of expert recruiters write something in the research as well, and they're saying still the basic skills that gallery wants are not necessarily all digital skills. They're based on their expertise in particular sectors, and strong salespeople, I think, are with networks and things like that, were still what a lot of galleries were looking in. And again, looking forward, some positive findings. Most galleries feel their employment is going to stay stable for the rest of this year, and some interesting movement there on the bigger galleries. Over 40% of galleries turning over 10 million were thinking of employing more people in the second half of the year. So all the galleries over 1 million, a fair size of them, a fair size share of those looking to employ more people. So this is really positive dynamics for the sector, because it did, at least on average, take a dip in terms of the numbers employed in 2020. So these are positive. There's been volatility, but it looks like it's turning the corner again. And when we were looking at employment, I think it gave us a chance to just reinforce some of the things that have already been established in the research in terms of the framework in the sector. And I think a lot of governments probably struggle with understanding how galleries and this sector works. They think of it as a retail sector that sells goods, when in actual fact, it's a professional services sector in many respects. So the people employed in the gallery sector are, very well qualified. It's a gender-balanced mix of people that work in the sector. And again, we checked in on some of these key dynamics in the sector, and over 80% of the people working in the sector have third-level university degrees. Over 1/3 of them are PhDs or masters. So it's a really well-qualified sector, I think this kind of feeds into a little bit of the research we did with Sophie that we included in the study on the role of dealers, their expertise and their importance, not just for collectors. That's something that collectors value, is how knowledgeable they are and their expertise, but also their long-term relationships with collectors, and particularly with their artists all the way through their careers. And some of the statistics we used from Sophie showed the importance of commercial galleries all the way through an artist's career. They're present there, and not just big galleries either, a very diversified mix, a very distributed system of galleries working all the way through. Another kind of nice finding was also that it's a very gender balanced sector, and this is something I found in the research all the way along, that it's been the majority of people employed in the gallery sector are women, and there is vertical integration in the sector as well, so it's not just that there's a lot of women employed, but there's a lot of people that have in higher positions that are women as well, which is a very positive indicator in the sector. So in the primary market, in this research, about 50%, just over 50% of people that either founded or co-founded a gallery were women. When you look in partnership and senior commercial and sales director positions, the majority of people are women. So it's not just a majority of women employed, it's that strong vertical integration as well. So there's really positive dynamics in the sector. It's not just about the numbers employed, but the quality of employment is really strong as well. So some good findings this year to report, which is nice for a change. From last year, it was a little bit glum. So things are looking up, and it's just, I suppose, one of the key things that we did this, it gave us a time to reflect, I think, with all the buzz about sales going on outside in NFT platforms and online sales outside the gallery sector. It was nice to take some time to reflect on some of these important, what the role of galleries and dealers is, and the role they play in the art market.
Thanks, Jeni. Thank you very much, Claire, for that introduction. That was really, really interesting. So moving on to the panel discussion. In your first slide, Claire, we looked at the economic rebound in the first half of 2021 and how it impacted gallery sales across different parts of the gallery business. Now, Jasmine, I wanted to ask, what were your experiences here? Did you see that reflected in the way you did business on a day-to-day basis?
Yeah, I mean, so much has happened the past 2 years or year and a half that I feel like the market has been a lot of different, it's gone in a lot of different directions for me personally, but I think, to be honest, the thing that I have been trying to attune myself to more is the artists than the clients. So the artists have been experiencing so much, and our inventory has not been the same as it would have been another year. So that's really where I've been focused, is kind of like, I haven't been able to get the same amount of inventory as I would have usually had. So that's affecting sales more than anything.
Yeah.
And so it's hard to kind of measure that against other years, because usually we'd be having shows and artists would be excited to produce in shows. And there's some of my artists have been super productive, but some have just really been, in a different headspace like we all have. So it's a little bit hard to measure that. But like right when COVID happened, there was a lot of work that was in production that sort of ended up being completed around March, April, May, June, and I was able to do really well with all of that kind of in the beginning of COVID, so sort of opposite what some had experienced. And then by the time the fall came around, it was like, artists really took the summer to go outside and, get out of the house, and we just didn't have a lot of inventory in the fall. Anyway, so I don't know if that's a good explanation or...
No, I think it's really interesting because it goes back to where everything comes from, which is the artists and the work they make, which directly obviously reflects on Sophie's work and Sophies Research. So I was actually going to ask you later in the panel, but Sophie, could you give us a brief introduction to your work, and then maybe you can comment on what Jasmine just said and if it's reflected in your research?
Yeah, absolutely. So the research we conduct has to do with the dissemination of the work. So how an artist's career develops based on where the art is shown, basically. So from their very first shows, maybe in an art school gallery, to not-for-profit centers where they might be invited in a residency program or something, to having a commercial show and developing their careers from show to show, from project to project. And so we do that on 100 years. And the reason for the depth that we wanted to have for this data is that the goal of this research is to understand what are the patterns in the network, in the dissemination of the work, and what it tells us on artists' careers. And what are the institutions, the type of institutions that are actually accompanying this development of the careers of artists in different parts of the world, in different time periods. So there have been shifts, 100 years is a long time. So the art market, the art world has evolved. But what's interesting is that through this large quantity of data, you can understand how the networks are changing, how those connections and those paths are changing. And we're looking at how they are evolving and how you go from showing a GTT, from having an invitation to participate in a biennial in Asia or something else. And the quantity of layers help us understand the dynamics.
Great, because I think Jasmine was saying, she was able to have fewer exhibitions just because artists weren't making as much work.
Yeah.
They were busy with other priorities at this stage, which I think was a general reflection on how the pandemic happened. And I was wondering, in your data from last year, did you see this dip as well? I mean, obviously museums were shuttered and so on and so forth, but then there was a rise in online exhibitions that was concomitant with that. So I was wondering, did you see that reflected in the data you were looking at?
So what's really interesting in what happened last year is that a lot of shows didn't happen. A lot of work wasn't produced because you sometimes need a deadline or a project to actually get to work. But what's also interesting is how the networks shifted. So because of the usual paths for communications were broken, art fairs, for examples, or places where usually interactions happen between curators and galleries and artists, new paths are starting to emerge that have to do with how culture is evolving and how the research process of everyone in that ecosystem had to evolve, because you couldn't rely on the usual physical events to actually do your research. So that we're starting to see in the data.
Because in a discussion that we had that preceded this panel, you spoke of this idea of localization, that you have local networks. And we all know this from our own experience. There's the Berlin Art Network, there's the London Network, the New York Network, and so on and so forth. And then you said something really interesting, because you said that the digital space has become a place where culture is made. That's not just secondary and kind of like an on-top thing, but it's actual locality where these communications and these networks happen. Could you elaborate on that?
So by that, I don't mean Instagram.
I'm saying digital.
No, but I'll just, but just to frame what I meant by that is culture is this very complex process that is a collective process by definition, where intermediaries like you, like galleries, like curators are bringing to the front, to the foreground artists that they support the work of, and then the critical part is to actually find an audience for this work, and where this audience is going to be built is going to depend on what kind of emotion you're going to be able to create and where. So creating a very strong emotion based on an experience of a work used to be mostly happening in the physical world. There has been massive investment in the last 2 years in creating a meaningful experience of art online that has to do with providing more depth in terms of content and writing and producing content around the work, so that you can have something that looks like an experience of discovering an artist and getting a strong emotion from it online, which was very, very difficult to do before. Because it's not by just going on an artist, a gallery website where you see just images of works that you are going to understand the approach and the process and everything. So that investment in broadening what is actually shared online is allowing the discovery, the audience to actually discover new artists, and that's why we're starting to also look at that as a different place where culture is being made collectively.
That's really, really interesting and potentially explains this vast growth in digital sales that we saw in Clare's data, where, as we saw, they grew to 37% of the overall market that you surveyed, the galleries you surveyed, from just 12% in 2019. I mean, that's a tripling over 3 years, which is vast. Clare, is this trend here to stay, do you think?
Yeah, I think so. I mean, it's not. I don't think things are going to switch back. As Sophie said, a lot of people have invested a lot. I mean, Jasmine can probably speak to it a little bit better. But I mean, I think when we asked about what galleries' digital strategies, not in this survey, but at the one at the end of the year, it was all about the main strategies they've used, rather than kind of very high-tech tools and things. It's been about kind of storytelling and getting the content across in different ways. So, people have invested a lot in that, making the the content more full rather than that. So I think that, I think this kind of thing is here to stay. People had concerns before COVID about the event-driven marketplace, from the amount of fairs they were doing to the amount of travel they were doing, and all those kind of things as well. And I've always kind of thought fairs are a little bit of a luxury for people that can afford the time to do it. I mean, I feel very privileged to be able to attend them for work, but a lot of people are kind of chained to their offices and desks and can't get away for these kind of things. And they're a very important part of the collecting marketplace. So I think that the experience online will keep on improving, and it'll always be that case where it's a kind of a bit of a perk to go to a live event, or a bit of a lovely thing that you look forward to. And I think if there's not, there might be some consolidation in the number of events, but I think that the online thing is not going to go away or switch back, because people have got used to it. It was coming anyway. It's just ramped up a little bit more quickly than it would have done, I think.
I think that's really interesting. I mean, one of the feedback mechanisms that we've seen, though, is that this content is being accompanied by a sort of content glut, where there's so much online, also in terms of arts, and also in terms of digital offerings by galleries and by art fairs, that a lot of collectors have said it's really difficult to navigate. Now, Jasmine, I wondered, how have you responded to that challenge? How have you taken it up? And can you also maybe give us some insights into your peers there?
Sure. There's a lot to process with this conversation, because to talk about things online, there's so many different formats that it goes online. So I would say that I'm from a generation that was very invested in art as it emerged online in around 2007, because that was when a lot of my peers were just graduating school, and we all had desktops, and some of us might have just had like the earliest smartphone or whatever, but not really using it. And we were really looking at art through the desktop. And that type of culture, to talk about culture, was really strong at that point for a good, I would say, from 2007 to about 2012. And then I think smartphones became more prevalent and more, definitely not affordable, but through more financial plans accessible. And so people, I just had a very disappointing experience.
That's
I hope you didn't lose your thread. And on it goes. I think that was it.
Okay, so I think the way that information was taken in through culture, through digital culture, was much more quick. You could actually show things in a much more longer format in 2007, 2008. And you could argue that attention spans are shorter, but I don't know if it's so much that as it is like volume of intake that we're taking in. What I think has been very interesting about the past year and a half is that the type of digital consumption that has shifted is video and audio. So actually kind of a retreat back into a longer form of intake. So there's still a high volume, but people have more time maybe at their desktops, which is sort of a return to this kind of romantic idea of sitting down and looking at a large screen and being able to take in, a walkthrough of somebody's gallery or a video of somebody explaining what their work is about. We've started doing podcasts, the gallery, but not very many, but we kind of just do it when we have time. And I think that it can be a return to content in an interesting way. And I know we've all experienced some version of slowing down in the past year and a half, and maybe that things will speed back up again, but that's the part of the digital that I'm interested in, for sure.
It's really interesting that you're exploring new formats such as podcasts. You know, I think we've seen a big cultural shift where the institutional gatekeepers, so to speak, are no longer newspapers, say, or cultural institutions, but really a lot of the content has gone over to the gallery side, also to the art fair side, speaking on my behalf. But yeah, so and that enables you obviously to tell your artist stories in a much more kind of detailed way, in a much more invested way. I was also very struck when I read this report, Claire, that one of the larger headlines was really that the millennials have overtaken boomers as the biggest buyers of art. That came as a surprise to me because millennials were always, in the past reports, sort of wobbly, you know, we're not really convinced, and then now, wham, we have this huge explosion. Do we know why?
I think, I mean, they've been kind of flagged in a few of the surveys we've done with UBS as being really active. I think, you know, I wish I could measure this. I'm going to find a way someday to measure the size of everyone's collections and do a kind of some kind of metric on that. I think boomers probably still have very large collections, but I think it's about the activity levels that we're seeing now. And I mean, some of it's a life cycle thing. I think people are in a stage of building up assets, you know, whereas boomers might be in a stage of more consolidation of assets and thinking about what they're going to do with them next. But you know, there's been, I think it's the activity levels and the fact that they're buying not just contemporary art either. They're quite active in, you know, areas like antiques and things like that. So it's kind of it's nice to see that there is an interest across the board. But I think it's life cycle. It's the people that we survey, I have to flag, are wealthy and they're active in the art market. So they're not necessarily representative of all millennials, but they're certainly flagging. They're coming up each time as the most active. So I think it's the levels of activity and the fact that they buy across a range of different channels that we're picking up on, rather than anything like they have the biggest collections. I think that's another metric that I'd love to gather, but I just don't know. I don't know how.
Can we also talk about the transfer of wealth? Because one of the things when I spoke to Paul Donovan of UBS was he was seeing that we're seeing the biggest intergenerational transfer of wealth the world has ever seen. And I was wondering
it's coming online. I mean, it's kind of gradually happening over the next kind of, I wouldn't write boomers off just yet. I suppose I'm kind of, because I'm not a millennial, I'm a Gen X. So I'm just kind of conscious of not kind of writing them off because this is happening. It's going to happen over the next kind of 20, 30 years. But there will be a huge transfer of wealth from boomers to Gen Z and millennials. And it's not just the wealth that they'll give them. It's what is very interesting to me is the art that's going to get handed down, and will it be the kinds of things that the younger generations are interested in keeping, or will all of a sudden all this art of a particular type be put on the market? Probably what now is kind of post-war and contemporary and modern. I mean, there's a lot of similarities in some big collections in New York, for example, or somewhere. So will all that come onto the market in one big amazing kind of lump at some stage? And what'll happen to prices and popularity of those artists that are now the kind of superstars of the market? So it's very interesting, and it is a big wave of wealth being transferred.
So we might well see a rebasing of the Warhol market, for example.
Yeah. I mean, it's all going to, you know, it has to either stay in their collections and it might not be of interest, or come onto the market at some stage. So it'd be interesting to see what happens.
Definitely. I mean, I think that was to me one of the things where if I were a gallerist reading this report, I'd be like, oh, how do I deal with that? Maybe. I mean, Jasmine, did you have a chance to look into this, or what were your reactions there?
Oh, sorry. It's a really intense statistic just for other reasons outside of the art world. Yeah, I mean, I think it's funny to think about markets or artists re-emerging into the market that I didn't personally ever sell previously, because to be quite honest, I don't do secondary outside of an artist that I have already represented. So I don't know what areas of the market that would go into, if that would already feed into the larger gallery system for those that have dealt with the auction sector. And I was thinking about that statistic of how you were saying in 2021 where a higher price point where more work was being sold there, and I was already thinking, well, if you don't have artists producing, but you have artworks that are already made in the secondary market, there is an activity that can happen there no matter what the artist's production is.
For sure.
But I also think that there'll be a lot of implications on taxes, especially in the US, how people are donating things from that.
Yes, and I mean, we saw that that millennials are spending $20,000 on average on digital art versus $25,000 on average on a painting. And one huge thing was this headline that 9% spent over $1 million on photography, so there was this really medium-specific implication. And Sophie, I guess this is too recent to be reflected on how you're looking at artists' careers, but are photographers particularly successful at the moment in your data?
They are, yeah, they are. But you know what's interesting? I just have bouncing on the previous question. It's something that we don't like to discuss, but usually collections don't get passed down. They don't. Like there are statistics around that. In 80% of the cases, the heirs, the next generation, does not want to keep the entire collection. It's something that is uncomfortable because, as a collector, you often give a lot of care to building a collection. And how do you care for the future of that is a very, very difficult topic to situation to confront yourself to. So the donation to whom, which kind of museum is going to take a collection is in its entirety versus just pieces here and there that complement what they have in their vaults. It's a long process, and that explains also why at some point collectors stop acquiring and start thinking about the next phase. And they tend to pause and think, okay, what is going to happen of that? And should I build a private museum? Should I, should I give to a university that is going to keep the entire collection as is, or should I give an artwork here, an artwork there, and try to and let my family decide what they want to do with the rest? It still is a very complex process to go through. So back to your question about photography.
I think actually that's a super interesting point, this idea of a legacy and how to build a legacy and whether or not your children are interested in taking over that mantle. And that will, I think, in the next few years, get much more attention from various parties. I actually wanted to stay a little bit on galleries, and Jasmine, I wanted to also ask you, gallery business priorities, we did see from Clare that they have shifted over the last year and a half or so. What shifts did your gallery in particular undertake? Did you see any movement there?
Well, I think an interesting, I was joking earlier that I've been taking my own stats and looking at when galleries have opened. And I think that there's an interesting thing. In New York, so many galleries opened around 2010, 2011, 2012. I opened up in 2012, but I have a lot of peers that are here and some that are in the main gallery section for the first time. So it feels like we're in a moment that a lot of galleries are growing between that 8 and 12-year hump where they've done at least 2 or 3 solo exhibitions with their artists, and that means that they're starting to have their first solo museum shows, which means we're starting to have to get more staff in order to make all those museum shows happen. And so there is this sort of shift that's happening just outside of COVID that is just about the fact that this generation is kind of coming of age. So that's where my headspace is, to be honest. And a lot of people have been coming in and asking how we're doing, and there's all these exciting ways in which we're growing, but I don't think it relates to we cracked COVID and we figured out how to make money during it. It's just that we're 10 years old, we're almost 10 years old now, and so it's a huge factor.
Priorities change.
Yeah, just as maturing. Claire, do you want to comment on that? Or?
Oh no, I just was thinking your priorities evolve, in the kind of life cycle of your business, more than anything, rather than, yeah. And I think if anything, this period has given some galleries a chance to reflect a little bit more if they have had a slightly less frenetic schedule to do a little bit of planning. I remember at Talking Galleries and a few events like that, talking to how many galleries have a kind of a 5-year plan and a 10-year plan, and it was very, very low percentage. And it's not from any lack of capability of doing it, it's just from being so busy, on the kind of doing fairs and focusing on the next exhibition. So I think, if anything, hopefully it's given some chance for some galleries that do a lot of traveling and stuff to do a little bit of...
It's a very romantic industry. You have to come to all of our artists' openings, and it's highly expected. And if we're not there, looking into their eyes, it's like we're a bad boyfriend, and that's important. It's like COVID's taught us, actually, we can be present in each other's lives in different ways and maintain some sense of a life ourselves.
I just wanted to touch finally on our discussion of the market. the issue of NFTs, unless you've been hiding underneath a rock, we've all seen this massive explosion where we went from $17 million expenditure on NFTs in the first half of 2020 to $1.3 billion in the first half of 2021, which is the numbers I believe that you saw in your report. My maths is very bad, but that's, I think, times 100 or so. Is that correct? We've seen 100.
Yeah, I mean, that was the sales on Ethereum of all NFTs. So the art, of that 1.3 billion, the art segment was about 325 million. But still, it's huge. It's massive increase in sales, yeah.
And it's gone from almost nothing to this enormous presence. And can you comment on this sort of parallel market evolving? Because clearly there's a lot of NFT trading platforms like OpenSea.io that are exclusively devoted to NFTs, and some galleries are also involved in this, but a lot of the sales are happening in parallel to the gallery world. So could you comment on that relationship?
Yeah, I mean, some of those platforms have done really well. I think that the fact that these certificates are stored on the blockchain and they're instantly tradable has fueled that growth in this kind of secondary market again. That we are seeing some cooling off of the secondary market as well in that area. But I think it's been an explosion of interest, and I think the very positive thing about it is that it's got a lot more people that perhaps weren't looking at art before interested in looking at art. I don't think it's. I think everybody gets very excited about technological developments and new things happening and things like that. And I think things kind of settle into a more mature phase where the things that are kind of have lasting quality and that are that they last, and other things kind of go by the wayside. But I think there's some very positive implications from the whole thing for the digital art sphere, and also for the generation of people that probably weren't, some of them weren't looking at art before, that are now interested in there's kind of a cross contamination between some of these platforms and the gallery sector, and kind of both, that goes both ways. So I think that has been a positive development.
I mean, you spoke of as galleries as gatekeepers and the art business as a knowledge industry earlier in your presentation, and so presumably that also has a direct impact on NFTs, because what we saw was a huge amount of NFTs that wouldn't be classified, shall we say, as traditional art in many different ways, and that some of us potentially looked at quite skeptically. So
yeah, I suppose there's people that are interested in the kind of content and the meaning and the aesthetics, and there's some people that are interested in the scarcity and the speculative side of things as well, and there's a lot of people maybe in between. But I think as long as there is a need for people to understand and to be able to get some help judging quality or knowing more about the content, there'll always be a role for some kind of intermediaries. And I think a lot of these platforms are intermediaries in themselves. So there is, an opportunity for artists to sell more directly. But I think, artists and collectors, what they value most about galleries, I think, is the longevity of the relationships through their careers. I know, talking to collectors, that's certainly what they've said, is that they believe, working with galleries over the long haul benefits them building their collections, and also that they follow the same artists through their careers.
And is that true of Millennials and Gen Z as well?
I'm sure it is, as they go, as over time. I suppose I was getting this as a reflection from older collectors, but I think it's probably true of everyone. People value long-term relationships, and that's came out in all the research we've done from the collector side, especially, that people would still, they may choose to buy on a platform, or but if they have a choice, given the choice, that they would still pick buying through a gallery as their first preferred choice.
So that's really positive news for galleries, obviously, which is great. I just wanted to switch track back to artists, actually, and particularly to Sophies Research. So I was wondering if you could just generally talk, you gave us a brief introduction to what Wonder AI does, and then this is some of the results of your findings. So I wondered if you could briefly go into the slide and explain it, which looks at 4 different types of artists: emerging, established, celebrated, and star. So explaining those categories, I think, might be helpful, and where they show and how they show.
So the research we did with Claire for this report was very specific. We looked at artists that are today highly successful. So it's a sub category of the market, and we looked at this roughly 2,700 artists that are in the top 4% in terms of cultural recognition of the work, so meaning the amount of shows, exhibitions, residencies that they have had over the career. And we looked at what kind of institutions has shown their work at different stages in their career. So when they were emerging, first stage in their career, when they were getting to this kind of confirmed status, or we call it established, and when they got to celebrated and star, which is the top 4% for us. So basically emerging, underrepresented is the 84% of the artist population in our database, and then you have the top 16%, and in those top 16% you have the established and then the celebrated and stars as 3 subcategories. So what's interesting here is to see that commercial galleries have a role all along the path, all along the way. They actually have a more prominent role in the first stages of the careers, when museums are taking a larger role in the later stages. I think some of that is surprising and some of that is not. Of course, you would expect museums to be more active with more established artists. I think in terms of the consistent presence of galleries along the development of those careers, it's very telling of how crucial the role of the dealer is in making the career happen, in helping the artist develop a career, even just so by setting a deadline for a show. I mean, this kind of thing is, actually moving the work forward and being with the artist along the way is critical. So what we've seen in our data, and is something that we have, we're still researching and we are digging in many different ways, is how galleries actually act as a distributed system that is highly diverse and highly distributed geographically as well, that filters artists and kind of directs them through the network so that they can be they can get to meet their audience in a different scene, meet their audience in a different geographical area, and that usually happens through galleries.
That's really interesting. And who are those galleries? I mean, we took the liberty to do a breakdown of artists at different stages of their careers. Could, again, you talk us through the slide where we looked at the roles that different galleries, the names of the different galleries and how they have supported artists through different stages of their careers. And this one shows emerging artists.
Yeah, so we're looking at the very top 1,000 artists that started their career after 1985. So contemporary artists, and they are in the top 2% in terms of global recognition. And what we looked at is where they had shows along their careers, and what are the artists that showed most of these 1,000 artists at each stage. So basically, going back in time, looking at these 1,000 highly successful artists and seeing what happened 20 years ago. Who was showing them? Who was showing them before they were the household names that everyone knows on the floor map, right? So, and that's interesting to see that in the emerging phase, you will see none of the big fives. Or maybe Listen is there. Listen is there. Yeah. But and it's by singular location. So when we're talking about Buchholz, it's Buchholz Cologne. And it's really important to see that actually there's quite an interesting distribution. A lot of them are in New York. But you have Air de Paris in Paris, you have Buchholz in Cologne, you have, I think, Massimo De Carlo in Milano, you have a gallery in Amsterdam as well. And that is going to change when you follow these 1,000 artists along the development of the career. Actually, galleries that are mostly showing them when they are in the star phase of their career are mostly in London, New York, and a little bit LA. But we're just looking at the top 12 here. So we can also look at the global distribution of those, the entire population of galleries here. We looked at the top 12 because we wanted to look at the level of concentration. And if some galleries are actually showing a lot of these artists. And there's definitely a generational aspect to this in the sense that a few of these galleries, quite a lot of them actually, for the emerging phase, were created around late 80s, early 90s. So it's a little bit like what you said about having this kind of group of galleries, and let's see where your artists are in 10 years. But again, we had a conversation on that. I bet you they will be there. They will be in that 2%. there is this concentration still of a few galleries really showing more of what is going to be the new generation of forerunners, so to speak, in defining a new culture as well.
That's really, really fascinating. Thank you, everyone. I think that's our time for now. And I would now like to hand over to the audience. So please do let us know if you have any questions, and we have room mics that will be brought to you. The lady at the front, please.
Yeah, okay. Yeah. Do I have to have it on? Yes. Okay. My name is Sigrun Davidsdottir. I'm a journalist. There have been some anti-money laundering measures put in place recently, for example, in UK, in terms of the art market. I was just wondering, and this is mostly, I guess, a question for Claire, do you have any sense of how much of the money going into art market might be related to money laundering? I mean, there's a lot of speculation on it. Is there any concrete evidence or research on this?
Well, there's research being done all the time here and in the US, but I think there's certainly no evidence. I think if there was any data collectible, the people would be in prison that are doing it. I think I can just only go back to stressing what I've said already, is that it's a really very professional industry, and this is for me from having worked in this industry for a couple of decades now. There's always a couple of bad stories in the press that tend to taint the picture a little bit, but they're such a tiny, tiny fraction of what goes on. I mean, there are certain regional issues. For example, I studied the Chinese market up until the anti-graft campaign, and there was quite a few issues of money laundering there. But I think certainly in the US and in Europe, the vast proportion, it's a minuscule amount. I mean, I have no statistics on it, but it's a very, very small amount that could happen. And again, it's criminal activity. It's not something that's built into the market in any way. It's not how the market operates. It's something that's happening outside the marketplace. My kind of implicit knowledge and tacit knowledge from working in the industry is that it's a very, very small problem but when it happens, it's obviously a big issue, but it's such a tiny minority that it doesn't kind of factor in. And certainly when you see fairs like this and all the gallery associations that I work with, there is such a strong vetting process, and this is an issue that everyone's aware of. They're aware of the image that one bad story in the press can give the rest of the market, which is terrible, really, because people are, people work really hard. They're professional people with, kind of really good qualifications that are working. As I said before, it's like a professional services industry. But there's, you get a bad lawyer and you get a bad doctor and things like that. So it's not, there isn't a kind of a completely clean industry in the world, I don't think. But I think there's a tendency to have a kind of a very old-fashioned image of the business that you're in today. I think it's a kind of but it's just from a few, I suppose, bad eggs in that scene. But unfortunately, I don't have hard statistics on it, but I know there is research underway. Because it's been a lot of the regulations in Europe mean a lot of complexity and paperwork and stuff, especially for small galleries. They have a lot of processes to go through now. They have to have somebody employed to take care of certain records and things like that. So it's been difficult for them to stay within the reporting processes. It's more the administrative complexity. I think a lot of galleries and big auction houses were already gathering all the know your customer data anyway, but it's the pressure on small businesses, I think, to meet the reporting requirements that's the main issue.
More admin. Thank you, Claire. Did that answer your question? Another question is a lady in a white shirt. Yeah.
Keep the mask. Sorry. It's COVID rules. I was wondering if after COVID there would be maybe more trends in analyzing and doing the report in new ways that you found out, because I was thinking of two things. First of all, that I have the feeling that post-COVID there would be more like regional markets that pop up and that intensify themselves. For example, I live in a region called the Engadine in St. Moritz, and we have an amazing art market that is behind the mountains high up, but on 80 kilometers you have more art collectors, art collections than probably in some mid-sized towns. And I have the feeling that, for example, our region or the south of France or some other region like really crystallize as like some sub-art markets, and it would be maybe making more sense to analyze these regional markets than a whole country, and if it was going to some trends that you would be doing that. And a second idea that I thought would be interesting after COVID with all these platforms that pop up. For example, we also work on a tech and art platform to maybe analyze how all these platforms use the data of the customers of the platforms to analyze in a quite deeper way even how the young generation deals not only with buying art, but how they are on the platform, where they spend the time looking at, etc. So maybe like these two fields on a new way of doing the art market research.
Yeah, no, it's fascinating. I think there's so much room for a lot more research now. There's more data than ever. Regional studies are something that I do, apart from the work that I do for this global report for Art Basel. So I do regional studies anyway. But there's you get so much more depth when you look at one particular region. But I mean, I think even working with Sophie's data it's just exactly what you're saying. There's a lot more data than sales that is really important in measuring even performance and kind of not importance, but kind of career trajectories of artists and there's a lot more to be measured than more kind of qualitative measures, as you're saying, and even with Sophie's data, looking at something that you can track and that's quantitative, but it's not just about the money spent. And I think that was a very key thing with the thing you looked at with the star artist, was that it wasn't just although sales are very top heavy in the very, very top galleries, when you look at that pie chart, they're a tiny slice. Even those top 12 galleries are such a tiny slice of the rest of the galleries that are involved, even in star artists. So I think when we look at sales, and certainly global sales, it is quite one-dimensional, but it's very important to track the size of the global market as well, and to do those figures, because they're the kind of figures that the industry needs for lobbying and for reporting to government and for all those things as well. So I don't think it'll necessarily replace it, but I think there's lots of really interesting avenues for a lot more research. So.
And actually, to your point, we are doing a lot of work on local ecosystems and how these ecosystems are supporting specific categories of our artists at different stages. So, and that's super interesting, because then you can see that some cities or some regions are really like a wonderful support system for a specific group of artists in terms of demographics or in terms of career stage. And then artists tend to move to different platforms as they evolve. So it's the ecosystem dimension is very interesting in the sense that it also gives you a sense of the interdependencies and how maybe some of the what's happening in your area is actually feeding something happening in an apparently disconnected area. And this is actually something you see in the data, because you see the trajectories and you see who goes from where to where and what are the kind of the flux. What is which directions is the work moving? So it's very interesting dimensions that we've started to look at together as well.
And the gentleman at the front.
Hi, I have a question on NFTs. I'm guessing you all are familiar with the environmental implications of NFTs, and I'm sort of wondering, all other sectors are governed by regulatory instruments used in terms of carbon taxing and all of these things. What are the implications of this on the art market or the NFT market? Have you done any research on this, or do you have any sort of info on the trajectory of this?
So yeah, go ahead.
I think that the way in which this is like so like this is just my feeling, is that the people that are sort of around the whole NFT thing, they're going to change something about the way energy is being consumed. I think that's just, they're too smart. They know too much about it. They know it's a problem. It's going to change within the next couple of years. So I think that's really what we're going to see. But the consumption's bad now because they don't, it's a new problem.
And do we have any more questions from the audience?
Yeah, that's a good point.
No? Okay, well, thank you very, very much for coming, everyone. Thank you to the wonderful panel for your time and your answers. And yeah, the media review is actually downloadable for free on artbasel.com. So if you're interested, please do look at it. And if you're interested in NFTs, we're actually having a panel discussion at 3 o'clock on Saturday with the artist Simon Denny and a few other producers that look at it from the artist side as opposed to the market side. So thank you very much and enjoy the rest of the show.